Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this live stream event. Before we begin, I'd like to share two items. Our code of conduct. Microsoft Reactor seeks to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and our presenters. We encourage engagement in the chat, but we ask that you're mindful of your commentary, remaining professional and on topic. Event guidelines. If this is the first time you're tuning in with us, if you're joining from YouTube or one of the other stream channels that we are broadcasting to today, you may need to have an account set up and signed in to interact in the chat. So make sure you've done that now. If you do have questions that you're unable to ask while we're live, feel free to reach out to us directly. I'll drop some additional information in the chat on that momentarily. And then again, if you have questions, the chat is your place. Feel free to comment. Let's begin. So today we are joined by Gwen and Kevin again for part 2 of Bicep Advanced Deployments. Let's pull our speakers up onto the screen here. One second. Hello, Gwen. Hello, Kevin. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming back for another round of Bicep Deployments.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca, as always, for the amazing introduction. We've already got a question in the chat asking if we can get the link to part 1 of this. So if we could drop that at some point, thank you very much. Hey, Kevin, welcome to the second part of your series. I'm here just kind of tagging along, learning some Bicep. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Gwen. Another great day to do some automation.
Perfect. Love that feeling. But yeah, everyone, today do you want to do sort of like a brief recap of what we covered in the first one?
Sure, we can do that. So I guess I'll start by introducing myself as well. My name is Kevin Oliver. I'm a machine learning engineer with the Octavian Group. Part of my job involves automation, machine learning, Azure development, and deployment. So automation is very near and dear to my heart. It makes my job easier and makes it easier to get things done for our customers. So Bicep has been a great tool to add to that tool set to get infrastructure as code deployed significantly faster than in the past. Anyone who's worked with ARM templates knows there's a lot of overhead and a long learning curve to get started with it. Bicep takes all of that out of the equation for you and really lets you get going and creating more complex deployments easier, saving you a lot of time.
Yes, perfect. Well, welcome, Kevin. We have a jam-packed session for today, I'm assuming.
We do, yes. In the first session, we went over and did a small demonstration of updating and making our code a little bit more efficient. Today, I went a little bit farther and expanded that deployment to include a couple other tiers, just as a sample application that you might want to deploy. But we're including things like alerting, setting up access into Key Vault and adding and creating keys inside that Key Vault. All those additional things that once you create a storage account and once you deploy it, that's good. But then how do we secure it? How do we make sure that any important information is stored securely during that deployment as well? There's a lot of extra little nitty-gritty pieces that you want to make sure that you think about as you're creating your templates and how you're going to manage that information going forward.
Perfect. So everyone make sure to utilize the chat if you have any questions. Kevin's been great about answering those, but yeah, we can get started if you are ready. I can bring up your screen. Let's see here. Perfect. All right, I see you got the ultra wide going on.
Let me know if it is too big. I can shrink that down about. Let's see. Let me jump into my first file here and let's see what it looks like.
Yeah, if you can make it a little larger, just because we got like a weird aspect ratio thing going.
Got it. What if I just cut a screen here?
Yeah, try that. Let's see.
Any better, or still is?
It's only on the half side. So you're sharing your whole ultra.
I'm sharing my whole screen.
Yeah.
Would it be better just to share Visual Studio?
Try that. Yeah, there you go. Try that. Chat, let us know what you think about the sizing here. Let's bring that up there. All right, now try zooming in. Maybe like one. Let's see. Let's do full screen of that. One more maybe.
All right.
Okay, perfect. I think that's good.
We're getting right in there then.
Yeah.
This will be there'll be a lot of scrolling for this. Okay, so first off, we'll talk about some of what we're going to deploy here. Um, let's show some of our. This is going to be a little rough, but we'll work through it. So first thing we're going to talk about is deploying some. We're going to do a classical deployment. So we've got some shared resources, Key Vault, Cosmos DB, application front end, and a front door. So we're going to be deploying resources um, into different resource groups, sort of aligning with what part of the application tier they're in. And there's a couple different ways that you can go ahead and do that. Um, so as you're building out your applications, you have to decide how you want to um, deploy your resources within inside of your subscription. Is everything going to live in a single resource group? Do you want to have things deployed by tier? A big portion of deciding what you're going to do with your infrastructure as code is where's that code going to live? Are you going to deploy the infrastructure as part of the code as the actual application itself, or is that going to live in a different repository? There's a lot of different decisions that you have to make around that, and that's part of your deployment strategy for your applications. In my case, I've broken it out by the different tiers. So I have a shared resource group tier that's going to have anything that gets touched by multiple applications. That can be things like application insights, um, storage accounts, some alerting logs will get shipped to that shared location. And that's what we're seeing here. We have our key vault with all of our roles that are going to get assigned. We have a front door that's going to be the entry point from the internet for the application itself and all of the pieces that are related to that. You can also see we're deploying diagnostic settings for all of our applications. A big piece of getting Azure resources out there is also being able to monitor them going forward. You can't just deploy the app and then at least put some kind of diagnostics in place to understand when things go wrong. So we're going to get those deployed out here as well.
I have a question already.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to deploying application code, is there sort of like a method that's like a best practice, or does it really depend on like company to company?
From my experience, it's really been company to company. Um, there are some companies that want to have specific pipelines for the infrastructure as code because they don't want it to run every time that a CI push happens. They don't want to get an update to code that maybe doesn't necessarily need to be done. Um, the last couple deployments that I have done, we've done infrastructure as code, all of the infrastructure as code templates with the application component that was going to be deployed, and then there were separate pipelines for the application itself and then for the infrastructure. So there was a Azure DevOps pipeline that would target the infrastructure folder. Anything changed in there would kick off a CI to validate that the templates were good and nothing. What's changed is actually still valid, and if it runs a what if, we could see that everything gets created successfully, and then that was a parallel process for getting a parallel process to the application itself, because the infrastructure once deployed doesn't change too often.
Yeah.
In the case of like app services, you might maybe add a new deployment slot. So I want to add that into my code and make sure that the slot's deployed as well. Or you need to add a new subnet for a new piece of the application. But once it's there, minor tweaks. Usually it doesn't change too much. So it saves you a little time, especially with longer running pipelines, to have that in its own pipeline.
Yeah, that would make
But
sense.
mileage will vary depending on your company. That's the nice thing is there's a lot of flexibility to make it work for however you're doing your deployments.
Cool.
So this is going to be a little larger bicep file, but for those who didn't watch the first part yet, I arranged my templates based on parameters, variables, and resources. So everything gets organized into their own sections. I try and make them as verbose as possible. So whoever's looking at my templates will be able to understand what a parameter is coming in with. There's meaningful descriptions, or try to make them as meaningful as possible, so that if a coworker or if another client uses these templates, they'll be able to sort of understand the thought process as to what was there and why it's there. We also have you can see here is our variable section. I like to do all my creation for names or reusable reusable pieces up here in the variable section, and then pass those throughout the rest of the template. It makes it easy for updates later on. And then we have all of our resources we're deploying as well. So I don't know if I want to dive right into the, let me show you what it looks like from the portal, because there's something that I have already deployed. I wanted to make sure everything was working good before we jumped into it here.
Mm-hmm.
So let me.
Cool. While you bring that up, I'm going to grab a question here. That guy Jay asks, Cloud Novice here with a quick question. When I hear infrastructure as code, or IAC, I think about using code to automate or deploy many parameters at once. Is this hitting somewhat close to home? And then there's clarification. Sorry, I meant to say resources. That's correct. Essentially,
Yeah,
you're
that's
grabbing your infrastructure and putting it into code. That way, instead of clicking around or using individual CLI commands,
yeah,
you just have one
absolutely.
file that you execute.
Right, and as you can see in this resource group, we've already got 11 different items that were deployed, 10 really, because there's one in there that isn't supposed to be there right now. But we have our key vaults, we have front door, we have application insights, we have our log workspace where all of our logs are going to get shipped to, and then we have virtual network. And this is, this shared resource is just, you know, I like to be able to, I like to organize that application into, usable parts, because a lot of times when we're doing our deployments, being able to understand where the application is and the resources are quickly. I mean, to me, that's what resource groups are good for. But we've tagged all of our resources so we know what application it's for and the environment it's part of, and whether it be a pipeline or whether it be like a CLI deployment, tagging is very important. So when you do come into this portal, especially once you get to start deploying lots of infrastructure as code, to have a created by or a pipeline name, some kind of tag, so that you can tell which pipeline deployed your application or your app service that's out there, any of the services, really makes it easy to go in and hunt versus trying to go into Azure DevOps or GitHub and look at 15 different pipelines before you find the right resource. So very nice from there. Just some of the parts I want to mention, like as I mentioned before, diagnostics. It's really important that we're deploying out all of our diagnostics as we deploy our resources, so that later on, once we have to actually manage these things after they've been deployed for a while, we have a way to put in way to be alerted and to track what's happening with our resources. Just getting the network or a virtual network deployed is great, but being able to track it and understand what's happening inside of it is useful as well. And with that, let's look at how some of that code works. So for those I guess for those who haven't seen it before, in Azure Monitor, when we create our alerts, our alerting all come in here. You can create action groups to get your alerts, and you can tie different
Oh,
either.
hold on. We got a question here. Should we be seeing the portal right now?
Yes, we should
We're
be seeing the
seeing
portal right now.
we're seeing Visual Studio right now.
Yes, you are right. Thank you. Let me jump.
Perfect.
My bad. Thanks, folks. Here I am talking about everything in a portal that we
There
cannot
we
see.
go.
Let me run through that again real quick. So our resources we're deploying, how does that look? Big enough?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, as what I had mentioned before, tagging really important for your resources. Let this is the pipeline that created this, the resources in this resource group. Makes it very easy to go back and hunt down where something got deployed from. I had mentioned before in our virtual network group, the diagnostic settings, all these are being deployed as part of my templates. So I don't have to worry about a resource getting deployed out into Azure without having some kind of diagnostics being created and being sent someplace. It's great for dev or some test environments if you're not logging anything or you're not looking for metrics. But as soon as you get to production, everything you deploy should be getting logged someplace so that you have some insights into what's happening into the environment. And the more that you do that as part of your infrastructure as code deployment, the less likely it's going to be something someone forgets to do. No one wants to worry about diagnostic settings or monitoring or alerts. So if we can automate those things and make them easier to be deployed, it's less likely that they're going to get skipped. So I'm going to jump over to Monitor just to talk about the alerts and what they look like before we go see what they look like in code. So as I'd mentioned, action groups so that we can use these as targets for our alerts. I have alerts going to everyone in the monitoring reader role in Azure, and then I have alerts going to my email as well. And then we have a couple of alerts that we've created, some default ones that are created by Application Insights, but then a couple that were created through our infrastructure as code to monitor. In this case, we're checking for normalized RU consumption greater than 90% in Cosmos DB. So if our Cosmos DB goes over that 90% normalized RU, it's going to send off an alert to us. So these are really powerful. It's really nice to be able to include these as part of your deployment. So things go wrong, something's going to go wrong sometime. To have alerting in place to help you understand when that happens is very critical. Let me jump back. There's gonna be a little jump back and forth if I.
Perfect.
Great. So that first part, I'm gonna pull up two things and let me know if it looks a little wonky here. That's gonna be too big.
I think that's good.
Looks good. Excellent. All right. So on my left, I have my my demo shared services Bicep file. This includes all of the resources that are going to get deployed out into that shared services resource group. So that includes the alerting, action groups, application insights, and all the diagnostics. On the right-hand side here, we have the parameter files that's going to do that deployment. So I'm a big fan of using parameter files per environment to get my deployment out. It lets you be very flexible with being able to reuse a lot of what you've created across multiple projects really easily. We talked quite a bit about the deployment files in the first session, so I'm not going to dive in too deep with that right now, but I will go over some of the what's here. So ideally, what you want to aim for is working with objects as part of your deployment. So objects will contain all the items that you need for a certain application or service. So Key Vault here is a good example. We have all of the different properties we're going to be setting on our Key Vault here as one object. So when I come into my deployment here, or into my Bicep file here, I'm just passing a single Key Vault properties object instead of all of these parameters. As you can see here, even with using these objects, we still have quite a few parameters that we're passing in. So to be able to minimize the number that we're passing in can really save you a lot of screen time or a lot of space in your file and just cut down on some of the complexity. We're controlling also what logs we're going to be deploying with this and how long that's going to go out there. And even with this file, you can see it gets fairly long. We have our subnets that we're deploying, and the power of these objects is really very good. If I needed to add a new subnet instead of having to do something else, I can just copy and paste a section, add in the new subnet name and the new prefix, and away I go. It really lets you be very flexible to extend and modify it. Yeah, it's really good. And as you can see here, actually, these subnets have different sets of properties as well. And we'll take a look at it real quick. You can add flexibility into your deployment also to check whether something exists and then deploy it or not. So again, making it a little bit more as flexible as possible to be reused. We have our role assignment, and here we have our action group properties with what's getting passed in. So we have our email receivers and our ARM role receivers. There are a couple other different types of receivers that you can have for action groups. You can go out and see those on the Azure API websites. or on the Azure API website. They have all the different templates and all the different properties that you can use. In our case here, we're just going to stick with email and ARM roles. And then you can see here all the other additional information that we're doing for our front door and other services. And this starts to get kind of long, right? We're deploying 11 services. We have several modules here that we're using for our deployment, but it still gets manageable. I mean, it looks very complex and very daunting the first time you look at it, but as soon as you start using it and start getting comfortable with the layout and how it's there, it becomes less intimidating. Um, Here's to hoping that eventually we'll be seeing a Bicep parameter template file, and then just let that convert to JSON. If you do want that, go out to the Bicep repository on GitHub and make a suggestion. They've talked about it in the past. If enough people ask, we can probably get it.
I've also noticed that a lot of it is not necessarily repetitive, but you start to see like very similar like elements where oh, I understand that this is an array, or I understand that what this function does.
Right.
It's more so just essentially customizing it to whatever resource it is that you're like working with.
Exactly, and that's a great point. There are a set of core object types that you can work with. You have objects. We have strings here that we're working with as well. We have sorry, that's an object as well. We have arrays that we're working with, and then we do have some Boolean and integer values as well. So there's a small subset of what's here. The flexibility is in how you can combine them together to make one bigger object. And it gets complex. I mean, there's ton of squiggly brackets, and you lose one and everything goes a little haywire.
Yeah,
Visual Studio honestly has made it so nice to be able to work with. Adding in this feature where I can hunt down and understand where my last bracket is. I mean, that's a lifesaver. I mean, it saves so much time trying to add and remove brackets to make sure I've got the right organization, or the not organization, the right formatting in place. So we've looked at some of our values that we're passing in. Let's just look at how those action groups are getting created. So we go into our module, just awesome tip, control left click,
yep.
bam,
Another
right,
thing
right into the module. It's fantastic. So if we look at our action group, we're just passing in a few parameters. And then we're going to be calling in an action group, and then creating the action group. We're passing in our short name, and this is this is a good point where good tips, right? The short name 12 character limit. You can also add a tag here to limit max length as well, which would be useful. Now if someone tries to put in something over 12 characters, is this going to fail? So, try and control your parameters as much as possible. If you know something can only be a certain limit, or if something should only have dashes, or if something's optional, you can always make notes in the description. That's a great place to provide information for others who might be using your templates later on, to be able to easily reuse them for different projects, or it's all about generalizing your modules as much as you can. We want to make them as reusable as possible. And to that effect, as we look down here in our email receivers and ARM role receivers, we're using another function to check if our property group even has email receivers or ARM role receivers. If those properties don't exist in our file, it's just going to pass in an empty array. And so if there was another, let's look here. So here we go. There's logic app receiver, right? So if I didn't have logic app receivers in my code, but maybe someone else does, now it's going to go ahead and provide a way to flexibly say, does logic app receivers exist in my property? And if so, I'm going to go ahead and use that as to what should be deployed. And if not, I'm just going to pass an empty array. So again, making your modules very reusable across multiple projects without having to do a lot of rewriting. And that's the goal. And that's really what Bicep makes Bicep makes so much easier for you to do is just to be able to reuse code over and over again. Take a module, hopefully all you're doing is extending it. Like in this case, hey, we're using our action group module in a new project. They're using logic apps. We've just extended it so now it can accept logic app receivers. And now the next group will have that option available to them as well. And we'll just leave that there because that'll just continue to work. And real quick, I want to show the alerting that goes with that. Oh, that's going to happen in another one. Sorry, I'll do that in a second. And I guess that's, we just talked about the contained stuff, so we won't show that here. Like in, just like within the action group, any of your modules where you have an opportunity to extend out and add additional functionality, contains is a great way for you to give an option of finding if a property exists in your parameters file or not. In the case of these subnets, if we look at my parameters file again, oh, I didn't split that. We have there we go. We have 3 subnets that we're deploying, but each of those subnets has different properties that's working with. My private endpoint subnet only is setting up private link properties. There's no service endpoints and there's no delegations, but because of the flexibility that we added into our virtual network, it can deploy all those different subnets without having to do 3 different resources or doing other fancy logic to make it happen. Let's do 3 different deployments even. We can deploy varied resources easier, and I can't think of the word off the top of my head. We're good there. But as part of that too, here we also can see our diagnostics that we're deploying out to the virtual network. So we're creating our name for our diagnostics, all of the different properties for our workspace, and all of the logs. When you're looking for this information, I highly suggest going out and just looking at the actual Azure resources in the portal. All the log information will be there. You can see all the information that you want. Another great way to do it too is if you have resources already deployed, using this Bicep insert resource will let you go ahead and choose a resource you already have deployed out in the portal, and will import it for you and try and give you information. It does a pretty good job. Some things are not as good as they could be, but it does a fantastic job of converting the information out there into a nice little Bicep template for you to work on. The only downside with that is if you're working on like diagnostic information, that is not kept with the actual virtual network resource. So if you were to export that, or even if you go out to the portal right now, you don't get to see that information as part of your deployment. So it's a little frustrating. I actually have not been able to find out a good place to get that diagnostic information as an export. If anybody knows, please let me know. That would be great.
That'll be a good thing to look into. When we talk about diagnostics, we actually have an interesting question here that I'd like to address. So is there a general set of best practices when we think about what alerts need to be set up or what metrics should be tracked?
That's a good question. Microsoft does. They've had best practice guides in the past around alerting and recommendations around different services. A lot of it comes down to your usage, and there's a couple different kinds of alerts you can do. Right? There's static alerts, there's dynamic alerts, and I believe the last one is log alerts. But static alerts are CPU goes over 90%. I'm going to send an alert. and it's very rigid. Anytime it goes over 90% for whatever reason, that's what's going to happen. In the other case, for our dynamic alerts, I can have it go out and look at the range. What is this resource using on average? Does it peak sometimes? Does it stay in a certain area? And it starts to learn and understand what the usage of that resource is. And that, I think, is a better way to go to help you understand what is the trend in the usage of your service, right? Maybe on Wednesdays it goes up to 75% for an hour, but then goes down. It would, not be great to have an alert just because it happens on that day, but trying to the sooner you get diagnostics in place on your resources, the sooner you can start to understand, where the peaks are and where you see issues at. You can start to correlate, oh, the app went down or the app was really slow, and we see the utilization was at this point. So that's a great way for you to start setting your alerts that way. Every app's going to be a little different with what they use and what they have. Maybe you have a set of APIs and all the APIs take 1 millisecond to run, but there's this one that just takes 5 milliseconds every time. Do you want to set an alert for anything over 1 millisecond to cause and have it get alerted every time it runs? Or do you want to set it to 5 and then miss all the other ones that might be going way slower than what they were supposed to? So it's unfortunately going to be a depends part. Really get the diagnostic information in there and start looking at the trends in your apps. That's going to be the best way. Microsoft does publish some suggestions, I know, around stuff like Cosmos DB and probably on app services as well. I don't have any direct links off the top of my head though, but I'm sure they're out there too.
Absolutely. I would also add that, a lot of these services can be, virtual machines are essentially the same in every platform, right? And you'll have a set of diagnostics that will be, or alerts that will be standard. So yeah, a little bit of research would probably give you some good tips there.
Right. Yeah. Like and you're right, in App Insights, if you have that set up for your out of the box application, Insights has a couple default diagnostics that you can set up on it. So if you look at these, there's a bunch of memory leak rules and change detection that they can give you out of the box, and those might work for you. But you're really going to have to tune it after you start getting a lot of traffic through your application and understanding, just what is special about your app and what you need to set for that, so you catch those issues that are going to cause you problems.
Perfect.
Awesome. And just because it's a bit of a more crazy module, I want to jump into and talk about Front Door. If anyone's deployed Front Door, it's a pretty complex beast. There's a lot of pieces going on with it.
Doing it earlier today. What a pain.
It is. It is. Yeah. It's the newly released standard and premium versions look like they're a little easier to work with. The classic Front Door, as it's called now, is really. It was complex. This is probably one of the harder templates that I had a time with getting set up properly.
That was another question I was going to have for you. What resources have you or services have you come across that have been just more difficult to work with when it comes to Bicep?
Front Door. Front Door has been the hardest so far. Yeah, I gotta say it's probably Front Door just because of the complexities, right? Like there's issues with, like, you need to create CNAMEs so that you can register your custom domains and things like that.
So it's DNS.
And yeah, it's DNS, right? My provider, let's say my provider is out in Cloudflare, we'll say. I don't have a way to easily automate going out to Cloudflare and creating a CN as part of my pipe, or at least part of my Bicep template. Maybe there's some API out there that you can get and use it that way, but if my DNS was inside of Azure, if I had a nice DNS zone there, I would be able to control and add those entries as I work with it. And they've got some nice examples out in the documentation for Front Door for that, on how to create your CNAMEs as you go. But if we look at just some of the components that are part of this, we have our front endpoints every endpoint has some kind of a backend host that it's working on. So we have our default one, and we have our website that I've created here, and the host that it's going with as well. Plus, on top of that, we have probes to check to see if our application's alive. We have load balancing settings that go into it as well. And on top of that, we also have our firewall policies that we want to have inputted into this as well. So I've got a firewall policy that was set for deployment, and we have a bunch of different rules that were created as part of this. But who wants to go in and type all that stuff out? Why can't I just have that be deployed as part of my front door deployment? So if we look at some of the code we have here, we're getting our web application firewall set up. And then, as I mentioned before, all my front door info is coming in as a object. So all of that information as to the the global settings for the front door, what it's going to be called, is it enabled, are stored there. All of the front end information, all the back ends, all the probes, all that information is tied into that one object. And it's easy to expand by just copy and pasting a section and adding it in for whatever new web app that you need. In this, there are other caveats as well. Like there's some scripting that you might want to do if you need to enable SSL authentication for the site. I find it's easier to do that during a Azure DevOps pipeline or a GitHub Actions pipeline. But you can do that from Bicep as well. There's a deployment scripting resource that you can use to run PowerShell or Azure CLI from your deployment. But for me, it was easier to use that during the pipeline to get that configured.
That's a good tip there.
Yeah, and there's as much as we try and do everything inside the template, if you're deploying these through a pipeline, which is the eventual goal that you probably want to aim for, some things that may take you hours to get set up in your template might be easier to do just as a script in the pipeline.
Right.
If I deploy the front door and then after it I run the Azure CLI script to enable the SSL, okay, the path of least resistance to make it allow you to do so. On the other hand, if you've got a lot of free time and you want to do it, go right ahead. So, so we have our front ends, our health probes, and our load balance settings. This is where things start getting a little tricky with the backends, because backends are associated to a particular front end. So now we're talking about nested resources. And unfortunately, Bicep does not let me do a loop on front door info endpoints, backend pools. I can't go ahead and do a loop this way on something that's nested inside of an object. So to get to some of information, we have to do a little, got to be a little tricky to get to it. Let me pull that real quick just so you can see what I was talking about. So for each endpoint, there is nested inside of it a backend host. My endpoint and backend hosts. And these could be multiple hosts. In my case, I have one app service front end that it's pointing to, but if you have 2 or 12, 1,500, you can have these all listed here so that the resources can point to it, whether that's a load balancer name or something else as well. There's a bunch of different targets that you can use for this. But because this information is nested, I need to get to it somehow. So to do so, we've created a module where we're passing in each of our passing in our endpoint property from our front door info. And so now we can loop through the backend hosts that are there and then pass them back. So to help us work around not being able to loop on nested resources, you can use modules to get at those nested resources by exposing the property to the module and then being able to do work on that and add it into a variable and then pass that back to our template that called the module. So this starts to get really complex, but it's for some services where you have a bunch of different nested resources, it's one of the few ways to be able to do that. So I just wanted to show that, hey, this, you know, as many might be afraid to, start nesting a bunch of resources and run to that issue, because this took a while to get sorted, and want to just show that off as an example of a way to work through that while still keeping those resources nicely nested together.
How often do you find yourself using? Because this to me looks like, all right, pretty advanced, like something that you pick up along, like, after having done a couple of projects like this.
Yeah,
How often do you find yourself using this type of like syntax?
this syntax doesn't happen very often. There's only been one or two other times where I've had to do something like this to get resources out. There's a couple other different ways you can work on it to get around it, and I'll show those. Uh, because of the way the front door worked, it was easy to, because of the way that front door works, or the way that I was deploying front door,
Mm-hmm.
this was the best way that I had to get this information back to the front door as part of the deployment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, this is something that doesn't happen very often, and it's something that hopefully you can avoid with your deployments.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do, ideally you end up, pulling the property that you want, or the information you want, into a module so that you can expose the properties that are part of it, and then you can access them and use for loops and create the information you need, and then pass it back to the main template. And then now we just start creating all of our rules. We create our routing rules for front door, so we can redirect HTTP to HTTPS traffic. And again, to simplify our resource, I try and create some of the bigger parts as variables, and then just pass them into the actual front door object itself. So instead of having all these routing rules, redirect rules, pool information, load balancing settings, instead of having that all tucked into the resource, they're just up there in variables that are easier to address and review. And then I just pass in the information. Here's my front endpoints variable, the health probe settings variable, etc. And our routing rules are union together so that they both are added in. And a union is just combining the two variables. So I create a set of HTTPS rules for everything, and then I create a set of routing rules for everything. So to pass that together, pass those two different pieces of information together, we've used union to combine them. And then this is the last complex piece. So to tie our endpoint information that we got back from our backend pool. Sorry, I should have pointed out what was happening. So our backend pool, we're passing back an array called backends. So that's what's going to get passed back into front door. So for each endpoint in our front door information, we're going to loop through it, and we're going to grab the endpoint and the index of that endpoint. We're going to use the name property on endpoint, and then from our module, this is our module name here, for the index value, the output backend information is going to get passed through. And so in this case, since we've only got two endpoints, first one would be 0, second one would be 1, and then that would be the backend information that gets plugged in there for you. And this is just a variable that's being passed back. The the index lets you tie together different pieces of information. When you have to do something like create a module to get that information, get at the information you need in the right format. And again, this is not something you do too often. The indexing piece you do more often with, sometimes you'll use it around like virtual networks or subnets if you're trying to get to a specific subnet or find it, loop through all the different items there, but shouldn't be too often, but it will happen sometimes. But again, with the tooling that's in place, it really, once you've done it a couple times, it's not too bad.
Yeah.
And again, we have our diagnostics for our front door. We pass our information if we needed to as outputs for our deployment. Ooh. All right.
Before we keep going here, I wanted to highlight this question. Have you deployed an API service with Bicep? But I wanted to ask Alan for clarification by what you meant by API service, because I don't think there's an Azure API service. There's actually a couple ways to develop an
Yeah,
API
there's a
with
couple of
Azure.
different ways to deploy it, right? So
We
we'll see what
talking we talking app service. We're talking
Mm-hmm.
maybe API management. Maybe we're talking Azure Functions. Maybe could be a bunch
Right.
of different options here. So let us know what you're asking here. There's this other one that I totally forgot up here. Is it easier to share and update the Bicep module if you keep the infrastructure as code in a separate project / pipeline?
That's a good question. Keeping your templates up to date is really tough. Currently, or at least practices today, or up to a little while ago, you would have to go through and copy your modules from one project to another. I'm creating my shared services. Now I'm going to create the front end, so I'm going to copy the related modules that I need into that project and do whatever modification I need there. And now maybe I've made an addition to the virtual network that's in that part, or updated some module with a new variable or parameter or something. Am I going to remember to go back and update that in the other project? Having the infrastructure as code in its own repository would make it a lot easier for you to be able to keep that up to date. It becomes a little trickier too if a lot of people are calling from it that way. Bicep has gone a route with the Bicep registry to try and solve this issue. So what they've done is they've given you the ability to use an Azure Container Registry instance to host your modules and then call them from Bicep, or call them from there into your template, and then now you have we'll say, single source of modules that you can use across multiple projects in your company. And that's where a lot of the flexibility that I've talked about will come into play. Is the more you can make your modules more generalized or more viable across the different solutions you need, the easier it will be to use that module registry inside your organization. If you do a lot of deployment of app services or functions or whatnot, making sure that you take the time to make the modules as flexible as possible will stop people from avoiding using the registry and copying the module and just keeping a copy on their machine or creating their own GitHub repository of it from there.
Perfect. Yeah, Alan meant API management service. Do you have experience deploying API?
I have not. I've deployed APIs with app service functions, but I have not had a chance to do API management service yet.
Okay. Just a little add-on there. My experience is that APIM doesn't have a way to automate the routes with Bicep or ARM. It's kind of pretty hard to deploy routes with APIM. Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never gotten a chance to work with APIM, so I do not know that for sure. But I know there are limitations. I mean, you can't do everything, unfortunately. Sorry, 1 second.
Yep. Feel free to keep adding your questions in the chat. We got about 10 minutes or so left. We'd be happy to answer anything you've got. I think we covered all the ones that were in here so far. Did you have any other things to show us? Where are we at?
Yes. Let's.
Cool.
So we also are, as we talked about, deploying our Key Vault. So as part of our App Insights deployment, we are also taking a chance to import our Key Vault import our App Insights ID and our connection string into our Key Vault so that we can get that deployed as well, so we can access that easier from other applications across our deployment. I'm sorry. Where that is. It's a little harder with the screen being so small. Okay, I'm going to show this at a different point because I can't seem to find it right here. We're going to visualize this real quick. So a second deployment we're doing here is our Cosmos DB and all the related diagnostics and information for it. We're doing a private link creation. We're creating some rules. We're storing our Cosmos DB secrets in our key vault. And we're also creating our private DNS and private link for our virtual network on our virtual network so that our other resources can get to it over our nice secure connection, as well as our action group so we can get our alerts set. So what I didn't get a chance to show before is like here we have our static alerts, like I had mentioned before. They're very general, greater than 90% resource utilization. But then, and you can see here we also have the option for dynamic alerts or log alerts. And why I've got this broken out into its own JSON file is I'm going to use a nice feature called load text content, to import this into my Bicep template during the deployment. So instead of having to have a bunch of these static rules, which can, if you have a few of them, it's going to get quite long. I can keep that off to its side and make it easier to have a set of standard rules across different deployments, or make it easier to update without having to have a unmanageable parameters file. Just to look at how that parameter file looks. Again, the same sort of configuration. We've got our components that we're deploying. Again, creating as many objects as I can for my information, our containers and our Cosmos DB properties, IP addresses that are going to be allowed to access Cosmos DB, as well as the virtual networks here. And so normally I try and avoid hard coding names into this file here as you can, or as much as I can. But in some scenarios where like I'm going through loops of arrays and things, sometimes it's hard to set those name properties in that loop. So sometimes it's an easier option to get them set here and then just keep them updated. This all comes back to having a very good naming standard for your deployments. Figure out what works for your organization and implement that across all of your templates. That way, hey, I know that every deployment for me is going to have some sort of a shared resource group with shared services in it. So I can be very sure that if I set up a VNet inside the shared resource group, that's going to exist. Making sure that that consistency is used across all the templates will make your life easier when you're trying to hunt down why, someone named something a little different, or why something's not deploying because a naming standard isn't being followed. All right, we're just going to jump into the Cosmos piece again. Be as descriptive as you can with your deployment. The more information you can provide, the easier it is to troubleshoot later on. So this is a good point. We are getting our existing VNets that we're going to be adding in to allow access to the Cosmos DB. So that's also assuming those. So this also talks about sort of the priority of your deployments too, and that's another thing to think of is, as you're deploying these resources, is it expecting something to be existing already out there, and how are you going to get to it? So in my case, I have allowed virtual networks that these allowed virtual networks are going to the ones that are going to be allowed to have access to Cosmos DB. So if this subnet exists, it's going to grab the resource information for it and store it later, store it in this variable actually, that I can use when I deploy Cosmos to give it access. And again, add a little flexibility here. Instead of just hard coding that one value, I've put it in an array. So as we need more subnets to have access to Cosmos DB, you just create another item in the array, and then everything will just continue to work. We have a private, we're just gonna jump into Cosmos because this is another one of those more complex pieces, but so we're looking at I just want to show here the load context JSON piece. So instead of having to have that big JSON rule set, that's what happens when you get it. Instead of having to have that in our parameters file or have it someplace else, using load text content allows us to bring that into a variable and then pass it in as part of our deployment. It really helps to keep everything nice and clean, and really makes it easy to update that information as well. Or you could have a standard set of alerts that you're using for your deployment, but then also have custom ones, or standard across the company or all deployments, but then have custom ones for that specific application if you needed to as well. And we're setting a couple of capabilities around like our dev environment. Our dev here is a serverless Cosmos DB, but for production, it's actually going to get deployed to multiple regions. So we want to make sure that we have that flexibility to deploy Cosmos DB in whatever form it needs to be for our deployment, but also save money when we can by choosing like serverless options or some of the free tiers when we can. We're setting up our allowed IP addresses from our properties and the allowed subnets as well. And then we are creating our Cosmos DB. This is another one that has a lot of pieces to it because you're creating the Cosmos DB itself, and then we're creating containers as part of that as well. And we're doing the Cosmos DB account. That's just the single account that is the instance. We're telling you what locations we're going to be using. If it's prod, we're going to not set any capabilities, but if it's dev, we want to set it as that serverless one. And then we're setting our virtual network rules and IP rules. And this is nice and clean. We've done all the work up here in the variable area to make sure our resources are easy to read. And then we are now we're just doing a standard SQL is it SQL account? Yeah, SQL account in SQL database in Cosmos. And now we're saying that there's a possibility that our Cosmos account might have multiple containers. So the way this is configured is that you can deploy multiple SQL databases within inside of Cosmos, and each of those databases may have a different count of containers. So looking at I should just leave this up. So for each of our databases that we're going to deploy, our Cosmos account and the SQL database name, and there's associated containers with them. So instead of nesting those containers inside of the Cosmos account this time, I've actually created them as a separate, its own separate object. And I'm going to use the account name here to tie them together. So the Cosmos account name that it's working with is to do, and there it is there. So as it loops through my containers here, it's going to check the Cosmos account name, or it's going to check to see if the containers property for Cosmos account name matches the Cosmos account we're deploying right now. And then that's the only time it's going to deploy it. So this is another way if you don't want to get real crazy with nesting a bunch of properties or resources in say your parameter file, you can tie things together by setting up other properties across them that you can use to identify which one belongs to what. And I think I may not have, yeah. And so this is another good thing to mark here is our module is looping through each of the different deployments that we're using, and that's why we're doing the containers inside here. So for each DB account that we're deploying, now we might have multiple containers going into it, and then we're finding out which containers are actually needing to be deployed by the account name, and then it skips the other ones. So it gives you flexibility. One might have 2 containers, one might have 5, and it allows you to deploy whatever scale you need to.
Cool. Do you actually have you seen this? Speaking about Cosmos DB, hold on a second. We got a question here about this specific error here. There's actually quite a lot here. It says create an app service web app, try to grant it access to Cosmos DB with a custom role assignment, and we're seeing this error here. Without getting into more details, is this something you've seen?
Name property of the DB accounts SQL role definition. That is not.
And adds it here too. You're referencing a variable which cannot be calculated at the start.
Okay, so based on that error piece that's there, I want to say he possibly is using some type of an output to create a name for the role assignment, and names for resources. When I'm creating a name for not so much my module, but resources, you can't have that rely on the output of another module because it won't be able to calculate the name to assign to that resource before before that resource is created, before the outputs are calculated for that resource. So I don't have something like.
Interesting.
No,
That's
I
a
don't
good.
have.
It's a good tip though. That's a good place to start looking.
Right. Yeah, look at the names of your modules. If someplace in there, you should, if you're pulling information from an output or using other resource outputs there, try and remove those first, or try, if you're using a bunch of variables, maybe try and set them statically once and see if you can get it to go through. It sounds like it is that role assignment piece. So statically set that role assignment name. If it goes through, then try and figure out which piece of the, which variable that's part of that name is causing you your problem. That's where I would start.
It's a good tip. Good place to start. We are at time. We have maybe like one more question we could probably get to. Actually, I think we got all the ones.
Sure. I mean, if you don't mind if I just want to jump back to the portal real quick just to see.
Go ahead.
Great. Share it too, though. All right. It should be back up.
Yep, back up.
Awesome. All right. So just wanted to show in my resource group, we had our I deployed it earlier just because it takes a long time for Cosmos to deploy.
Yeah.
But just wanted to walk through some of the configurations we have, right? So our VNet had been configured and set with it. The IP addresses that were allowed to access it through the firewall were set as well. Our private endpoint was also created so that we can access it through our private endpoint. And if we jump back over to our key vault, and this is a good example of a couple different naming standards. Key vaults have a limited name or a limited span for name. So keep in mind all the different resources inside of Azure and all the different naming standards as you're trying to create your naming convention. And you might end up having to have a couple, storage accounts, key vaults. I think Azure Container Registries, there's a bunch of them where you can't have dashes or you can only have underscores. Keep all those in mind as you're creating those names and plan those out ahead so you know what those are going to look like as you create your resources. And does it matter to you what they look like, or do you want them to be a little bit more readable for people as they're looking at them in the portal? But if we look at secrets here, I'm of course not authorized to look at these secrets. Oh man, I didn't add myself in the role. Dang. So there should be secrets in here for Cosmos DB as well. Those were stored as part of our deployment. And we can see those from our deployments as we're deploying out SQL as well, or as we're deploying out Cosmos. And the key vault. Man, I should add myself to that role. But yeah, also I guess, and the last thing just to mark was the diagnostics information. So now we're collecting all of our diagnostics on our Cosmos DB, and that'll get sent into App Insights, which is a little tricky because some of these, App Insights is really tied in very heavily to Cosmos already. So you get this here, but if you need to do any of the log queries, we need to have that diagnostics information in place to be able to do queries. So getting your resources deployed with that diagnostic information from the start really helps to save you time when there is an issue and you realize diagnostics were never deployed, and now you have to wait till the error happens again, or you have to wait till you get enough logs to be able to track it down. So the sooner you get that stuff deployed, preferably when you're deploying your resources, the easier it's going to be to troubleshoot issues when they occur.
Awesome. All right. To close things out, we've got. Hold on a second. We've got this. There's no error hand. Wait, hold on. This one here. To export current diagnostic settings, you can use the following azcli command in a PowerShell session.
Ooh.
I'm assuming that's interesting. Output TSV.
Oh, will that output
Okay.
all of your resource diagnostics?
Says there's no error handling the command above to handle resources that don't have diagnostics, but you could filter the. Oh, so we're just using the output.
Yeah, he's getting it out
and
to
then piping
that.
it.
Getting into that TSV format. Yeah, I mean that's one of those things that's it's unfortunate that isn't surfaced better to be able
Yeah,
to
they
get
don't.
some of that information because ideally, especially when you're just starting out, to be able to go in and configure the resource the way you want in the portal and then export the template and then start customizing it to make it more modular is a great way to get started with a lot of these different resources. If I was going to go do one on APIM, that's what I would do. I go configure it in the portal and then export it and start figuring out what I can make more modular and figure out if there's any limitations.
Yeah, it would be cool to see like an AZ diagnostics list, and then you'd do by research something like that.
Right. Okay. All of them across the subscription, huh? Yeah, that'd be interesting. And that's a good way. I mean, if at least you can see what's out there, if nothing else, that would be good.
You just have to do some heavy filtering.
Yes.
Yeah, some pipe in there. All right, cool. That covered a lot there. That with part 1 and part 2, that wraps up the series on advanced Bicep. And then you also provided a GitHub repo that we added in the chat. Maybe we'll have you on again sometime soon to keep going with this Bicep stuff. It seems to be pretty popular.
Yeah, it seems to be taken off. It's good.
That's good. The link to Kevin's repo is on the screen. And then I'm assuming the demo code from the first session is also there, right?
Yeah, and I'll spruce it up a little bit. There's the demo 1 and demo 2, and then all the different modules that we talked about there today, and a few that we didn't get to actually are out there as well. So you can see some of the different. I was going for as close to a typical deployment. Deploying a front end, deploying database and associated resources for those. So you can see how those pieces connect and, check out my crazy thought process around deploying things and see if you can make it better.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. That's it. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us. Hope to have you back soon. Everyone in the chat, thank you for joining. And that's it for this one.
Yeah.
We'll see
Thank
you
you very much,
sometime soon.
everyone.
All right.
Have a good one.
Thank you both so much. If you're not familiar with the reactor, check us out. I dropped a link to the meetup page in the chat, but you can find us meetup.com, search Microsoft Reactor, find a location close to you. We also have a YouTube channel that we drop all of our on-demand content or our live sessions once they've finished there, so you can check out past episodes. Thanks all. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Gwen. Until the next one. Take care, everyone.